Thank you for being with us here on this Canadian Council of Churches Day of Learning in celebration of the 80th anniversary of the Canadian Council of Churches. My name is Peter Kunert. I am an ELCIC pastor and a current co-chair of the Faith and Life Science Reference Group of the Canadian Council of Churches. And our panel today, at the end of the afternoon, is to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the work of the Biotechnology Reference Group, which is our predecessor organization, and our current Faith and Life Science Reference Group. And to do that, we have three panelists here today. I'll invite them to come forward here. We have Stephen Allen and Dr. Rosemary Meyer and myself. And Rosemary is my current co-chair for the Faith and Life Science Reference Group. So each of us is going to talk for about 12 to 15 minutes, reflecting on our experiences, our involvement with this work at the intersection of theology, ethics, and biotechnology. And I'll invite Stephen to speak next. Thank you.
Good afternoon, friends here at Mount Zion Lutheran Church and friends across Canada and maybe even further afield. My name is Stephen Allen, and I had the very good fortune of serving on what was then called the Biotechnology Reference Group, is now called the Faith and Life Sciences Reference Group. My reflections will focus largely on the Canadian Council of Churches' participation as interveners before the Supreme Court of Canada on the Harvard OncoMouse case, and the partnership of the Canadian Council of Churches with the National Council of Churches of Christ in the USA, the South African Council of Churches, and the World Council of Churches in organizing a conference in Johannesburg, South Africa, December 2007. So I had the very good fortune of representing the Presbyterian Church in Canada from 1999 to June of 2018 when I retired on the Biotechnology Reference Group. And the timing for the creation of the reference group was important in a number of ways. At the time, I was writing and researching a statement on genetic engineering for our church. And within the Presbyterian Church in Canada, there are things called overtures, which may come from a congregation or a presbytery, asking for a statement on, it might be stipends for ministers. It might mean training for ministers moving from one denomination to the Presbyterian Church in Canada, but also statements on ethical issues. And I received one on biotechnology, genetic engineering, and cloning. And full disclosure, that isn't why the church hired me. I had no background in genetic engineering or biotechnology. So I found the Biotechnology Reference Group a supportive place to learn with and from colleagues from other denominations and to reflect on the theological and ethical implications of an aspect of science and technology that at the time was not getting much attention in Canada, either from churches or from most Canadians. So it was the reference group was a wonderful example of the Lund principle, which affirms that churches should act together in all matters except those in which deep differences of conviction compel them to act separately. And that was I think we lived that on the Biotechnology Reference Group. In the late 90s, there was extensive coverage of a major development in science and technology, a development that captured the public's imagination. It was the cloning of Dolly the sheep at the Rosalind Institute in Scotland. Dolly was born June 5th, 1996. And in that period, in the subsequent years, what I noticed were the cartoons that generally, incorrectly, captured some development in this science. But you don't see them today. But I had a whole file of cartoons that captured some aspect of genetic engineering. It was the public interest in Dolly the sheep and developments in genetic engineering that provided the context for the Canadian Council of Churches to give some attention to the many developments in this area of science. And the first major initiative was a day-long workshop in Toronto entitled Current Issues in Biotechnology. And this happened in December 1999. Current Issues in Biotechnology and Their Theological and Ethical Implications. And the speakers that day brought an impressive array of skills and knowledge. Skills and knowledge in theology, in ethics, in science, in law, and in agriculture. And there were over 100 participants in our workshop that day. It was energetic, it was challenging, and for some of us opening up a whole new world. Why isn't the church dealing with these issues? And what should the church be saying about these issues? I think what we learned that day was that genetic engineering and cloning offered the potential of curing diseases that until then were incurable, or of growing more food for a world in need of more food. The day also explored the downsides of genetic engineering and cloning, such as the uncertain consequences of inserting a gene from one species into another species. Who stands to benefit from these developments? Who will be excluded? How do individual nation states, as well as the international community, ensure accountability and transparency? I'm often reminded by what Ursula Franklin often said, is that science and technology have a social context. Science and technology have a social context. And in all these questions, what is the church's role? And how does the church discern between the benefits and the costs of biotechnology? It's not enough to say we're opposed to all of it. I don't think we should, and the council never felt that way. But what are the questions we should be asking? And later on in my presentation, I'll highlight some of the ethical issues that I think undergirded what we did as a biotechnology reference group and may well guide the Faith and Life Sciences reference group today. Now, that day in December led to the creation of the biotechnology reference group at its first meeting in December 17th, 1999. And the terms of reference are actually in the resource that's been produced for today, so I won't go into that. But I think what was interesting was that a conscious decision was made that membership on the biotechnology reference group would include individuals from the Council's two commissions, the Commission on Justice and Peace and the Commission of Faith and Witness. Question I would have, and maybe it's been dealt with, is how effective has this partnership been between the two commissions? And if an assessment hasn't been done, it might be worth considering. As gifts from the people from both commissions, how have these gifts enriched the work we do together? A strength of the Biotechnology Reference Group was the breadth of skills and knowledge of its members. Some brought scientific knowledge, such as medical doctors. Others as knowledge and skills as theologians and ethicists. And the reference group enjoyed representation from a cross-section of the council's membership. Again, another strength. And remember, those individuals and the respective denominations each had their own contacts in the wider society that we could draw on. Now, a little bit about the Harvard Oncomouse. In 1985, Harvard University applied for a Canadian patent on a transgenic mouse developed by scientists through the insertion of a oncogene, so a cancer-bearing gene, and this would be done for the purposes of cancer research. The Commission of Patents here in Canada refused the claim, which included all similar transgenic non-human mammals. It did say yes to the patent on the process of inserting the oncogene into the mouse. But when the commissioner said no to a patent on the mouse and other mammals, Harvard appealed to the Supreme Court of Canada. Now, at the time of the Religious Society of Friends, representative was Ann Mitchell, and she brought the issue of the Harvard Oncomouse case to the attention of the Biotechnology Reference Group and the Canadian Council of Churches. And with the approval of the governing board of the council, we sought intervenor status before the Supreme Court of Canada. And that's important to remember because we think the church has no voice in the public square today, or the church's views are not taken seriously. And we worked with the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada as joint intervenors in seeking intervenor status before the Supreme Court. Now, there's a two-step process in seeking intervenor status. One is the intervenor, the organization submits an affidavit which briefly states who you are and what your interest in the particular issue is. If you get by that step, then you're invited to submit a factum, which is a lengthier document that spells out in more detail the case you wish to make on whatever the issue is. Now, after the Canadian Council of Churches and the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada submitted the affidavit, Harvard appealed to the court not to grant the Council of Churches and the EFC intervenor status on the basis that the issue, patenting a multicellular creature, was beyond the expertise of the two church councils. The court rejected Harvard's request and ruled that it wanted to hear from us. Now, the court announced its decision on the December 5th, 2002, and the request for the patent was denied. It was a close decision. It was 5-4, but it's better that you're 5 and not 4. And this is important because, and I'll just quote a statement from Justice Bastarash, writing for the majority, held that the unique concerns and issues raised by the patentability of plants and animals necessitate a parliamentary response. Only Parliament has the institutional competence to extend patent rights or another form of intellectual property protection to plants and animals, and to attach appropriate conditions to the right that is granted. We're one of the few countries in the Western world that has not granted these kinds of patents. Now, Harvard, in arguing that the patent be granted, asserted that it was necessary and able to ensure biotechnology companies to raise money from investors for research and innovation. Further, Canada needed to grant the patent because similar patents had already been granted in the US and in Europe. And unless Canada followed suit, research and innovation would suffer. The Council and the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada did not challenge, as I said earlier, the technical processes of inserting a cancer-bearing gene into the mouse. The key argument, in bold terms, was that Harvard had not invented the mouse. That's the nub of it. Now, I haven't done an exhaustive search, and I could be proven quite wrong here, but in just perusing the business press, I've not seen any evidence that the court's decision in 2002 has proven to be a setback for science, technology, biotechnology in Canada. I could be wrong there, but I've not seen any evidence of it. A little bit now about working globally. The promises and the perils of biotechnology are global in nature. And in response to this reality, planning for an international conference began with a planning meeting in Toronto in May of 2006, co-hosted by the Canadian Council of Churches, the National Council of Churches of Christ in the U.S., and considerable support was provided by the World Council of Churches. Now, this planning meeting was a great opportunity for the 45 participants from around the world who represented different national and regional councils to get to know each other and to learn about the key issues in biotechnology in their countries and regions. So this meeting laid the groundwork for a conference in Johannesburg, South Africa in December 2007 called the Global Consultation on Genetics and New Biotechnologies. It brought together representatives from the All-African Council of Churches, the South African Council of Churches, the Latin American Council of Churches, the Caribbean Conference of Churches, the Middle East Council of Churches, the Pacific Council of Churches, the Conference of European Churches, and the Canadian Council of Churches and the National Council of Churches of Christ in the U.S. So the world was well represented at this meeting, and we heard about the challenges facing different parts of the world. I think the depth of the representation was a strength of this consultation. I think another strength were the range of issues raised at the consultation, reflecting the national and regional realities, whether it concerned the impact of genetically modified organisms on corn in Mexico or gene therapy in Canada. I think one of the challenges was how to hold this global network together. A few words about some ethical issues and questions which I think have certainly shaped my participation in the Biotechnology Reference Group. And bearing in mind the advice from Ursula Franklin that technology has a social context. Is the particular technology necessary in the first place? Do we need it? Are the institutions or corporations developing and introducing the technology accountable to society? Is there space for citizens' input? Much will often be said about the benefits of a particular technology, but what are the risks, and who names the risks? Are the advances brought about by the technology shared across humanity, or are the advances limited to wealthier nations? How does the technology contribute to human flourishing? Some reflections on being part of this august body. Our common faith, for me, was a source of strength as we shared our respective traditions through prayers and how our respective denominations approach these issues. The presence 25 years later of the Faith and Life Sciences Reference Group demonstrates the benefits, the rich benefits of working ecumenically. We are able to do much more together than we could ever do on our own. And these issues are complex. We're able to draw upon the expertise in our respective denominations, in science, in medicine, in agriculture, in law, in theology, in ethics. And often these people who are members of our respective congregations maybe are just waiting to be asked. Through the World Council of Churches, we've been able to connect with churches around the world. And the conference back in Johannesburg in 2007 was an excellent example. I think the challenge has been the capacity to work together globally. As we know, many of the introductions in biotechnology have global implications. How do we collaborate on specific issues? Who names the issues? What resources do we need, financial, human resources, to keep this together? How might we have maintained the connections that were established at that conference in South Africa? As the Harvard Oncomouse case demonstrates, there is indeed a role for the church in the public square. And whenever we made overtures to scientists at the University of Toronto, we had great help and great support early on from the late Michelle Swarnichuk, who was legal counsel with the Canadian Environmental Law Association. But other organizations, we found an openness, and I think an appreciation that the church was grappling with these issues. Working ecumenically finally builds trust, and it builds friendships. And that's all from me. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Stephen. And Quakers have a similar kind of phrase. Instead of saying openings or overture, we say there's an opportunity. And my opportunity is to mention the role of the Faith and Life Science Reference Group in the Canadian Council of Churches. And I should say that our actual reference group includes 11 of the churches of the Canadian Council, 11 of the 26, and that's the members of the reference group. So I think it illustrates that we have moved on, and there are scientists and physicians of various stripes who are involved in the reference group. We have made a booklet, thanks to Peter Cunard, and that will soon be available. So I'm not going to say very much formally today, but mention just the headings, really, that I would like to cover. One is the development in the tasks of the reference group. The terms of reference were revised in February of this year, 2024. And these focus on the service of the Faith and Life Science Reference Group to the Canadian Council in three main areas: cooperation, education, and advocacy. We don't have a case anything like the Oncomouse, but we do have quite a variety of issues where we have tried to make our presence felt. One of them that I was kind of introduced with was started by Dr. Masterson, who was the previous associate secretary and who was contending with correspondence which was urgent. And that's another feature of the reference group, that we are scanning, we are monitoring, we are keeping our eyes and ears open about issues which are current and which can become urgent. And this was an urgent issue because the seeds, which had been regulated and overseen by the federal government, were being let loose by the federal government, who was going to leave it to the manufacturers. And you would say, well, you don't manufacture seeds. But in fact, a lot of the seeds are, in fact, manufactured and modified. We all know, I think, about the unfortunate farmer whose land was blown over with some seeds from Monsanto, and the extensive and rather debilitating legal consequences of this. And Monsanto were involved in recommending to the federal government that rather than the federal government bothering to oversee, then it would be such companies as Monsanto. And of course, Monsanto would also like to have some other chemical enhancement of its seeds, which I think, as you know, is enhanced to the extent that they are not viable for a second season. You have each year to have new fertilizer and to modify the seeds. So that was something that was really quite urgent. And so we had correspondence in which we tried to put forward the reasons why this did not seem to be a viable idea, and in fact was something that we were extremely concerned about. So that was advocacy and urgency. So there are three main areas that the reference group offers some service to the Canadian Council. Cooperation among ourselves. So if you have 11 scientists or people who have different scientific backgrounds, it does take a little bit of cooperation. We also have been looking at the present focus of the reference group within the Canadian Council. We continue reflections on the intersection of faith and science, and in the present triennium, this implicates humanity and AI. So artificial intelligence is one of the big themes of our present work. And there is continuing concern with machine learning and with robots. And robotization is a factor in far more than these friendly service robots, which give company to rather lonely old people. Robots are taking over quite a few human functions, not only in industry. So this is another area. And also further understanding of brain and computer interfaces. I think we've all heard of cyborgs, people who have had, well, there are not that many, but there are a couple of academics who seem to have their computers attached so that they have direct connection between their own nervous system and an artificial intelligence, hopefully, but an artificial system. Human enhancement is another area that's being explored. Now, part of this can be a very benign and helpful exploration. For example, the Paralympics illustrate tremendous research and tremendous advancement in rehabilitation. When you see these athletes on the field, on the track, it really takes quite a bit of readjusting your thinking to realize how far each of those people have come since their injury or developmental problem. So human enhancement in the benign sense of the Paralympics demonstrate practical issues of medical and psychosocial application. But our friends in the project Plowshares are showing the tremendous miniaturization of some of the weapons which are now available, smaller than your hand, almost imperceptible. So we're not looking at drones, which are malignant enough, but also on the miniaturization of weaponry. So what are some of the present activities? New members are joining and new concerns are arriving and arising. The terms of reference and the urgency of the commitment to further understanding are issues on our agenda. One of the urgent issues is not as urgent as the seeds, but it is that the call by Rome, the Rome call, ethical advancement and ethical knowledge before advancement is a big issue which the Council is being encouraged by the reference group, who have 2 members on the actual staff of the Rome Call, so that this is one of our academic members who is also a theologian. As the group, we have benefited greatly from reading widely. And I was quite tickled to see that some of the articles in the business section of the Globe and Mail could have been published in a scientific journal, that the AI, the artificial intelligence, was creeping into other areas so that it was interfacing with not only economics, but also journalism. And we have our staff member who has recently accomplished his PhD, who has been providing some of this stack of readings. I would like to ask Michael Buttery to give his perspective on working with this group as we are at the moment.
The main thing that you learn working for the Faith and Life Sciences Reference Group is that there is an endless series of issues and topics that we could engage with. There's no end to the advancements in science, in biotechnology, and now artificial intelligence, which is one of our priorities. And so the main challenge is simply choosing what to focus on and what to spend our sometimes limited resources. We have a lot of enthusiasm from our members, but I think an important part of our process is clarifying what is the primary interest of participants for figuring out what we want to work on and what that looks like, right? One of our main endeavors past few years, as you've heard, has been webinars. and also putting together published resources like this booklet. And my main role is simply to facilitate that. A couple other little notes about things that we've done recently, maybe, is that we now have a partnership with the World Council of Churches, which I think Peter's going to talk about a little bit. There's, recent work on AI, our webinar, joining the Rome call. I think if you read the news on a normal news day, perhaps not today, you'll usually find at least one news story about artificial intelligence. And the enormous interest we've seen in our conversations around this demonstrates how significant this topic is and how much we have to contribute. And then we're continuing to think about genetics, which has been a long-standing priority area. We've heard about seeds. We've done some work on gene editing. Seems likely that in years to come, we'll see more cases of gene editing being used for human diseases, or perhaps enhancement, which is something that we've talked about. Some things that go beyond therapy for a medical condition to improving human beings. And that's another area in which, our theological emphases of what are human beings, what is human nature, what is the goal of human life, what does perfection look like for human beings and the rest of creation. Those are theological questions which, in the absence of any dialogue, religious contribution, various other secular answers will answer those questions. So that's, I think, one of the ways in which there's a continuing important role for the Faith and Life Sciences group. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen, Rosemary, and Michael, for giving a good overview of the work of the Biotechnology Reference Group and the Faith and Life Science Group over the last 25 years. In the area of artificial intelligence, the Roman Catholic Church globally has done a lot of work in that area. The Pontifical Academy for Life, they came up with the Rome Call for AI Ethics that Rosemary alluded to. We have actually this year become signatories to that Rome Call as a reference group of the Canadian Council of Churches, and we will be challenging or writing to the governing board to ask member denominations to think about whether they individually would like to become signatories to the Rome Call for AI Ethics. So I guess that's one example in the near future where we will be asking denominations to rethink what their current theology is around artificial intelligence and whether they wish to articulate something different and be part of a global movement towards more responsible use of artificial intelligence. Thinking about the presentations today, the excellent presentations by our young adult governing board representatives and by Leah's powerful ecological presentation, we are each raised within our own denomination, within our own tradition. I myself was also raised within a tradition, the Lutheran tradition, and I have been grown in that tradition by people who are present here today over decades of my life. So looking out, I see Reverend Dr. Stephen Larson, who inspired me as an undergraduate student at the University of Alberta, part of the campus ministry program, to think about what my faith might say about the social ill of apartheid and how we might respond to that, not only locally, but nationally and globally. When I came to Waterloo Lutheran Seminary, I was inspired by my professors there. Reverend Dr. David Frimmer is here today, former Principal Dean of Waterloo Lutheran Seminary, who invited myself and our classmates to participate in social justice initiatives in Ontario and to think nationally and internationally about how our faith informs us to be involved in the problems of the world and come up with solutions for all of humanity. One of the reasons we chose this location for this day of learning is that this is the home church of another principal dean, former principal dean of Waterloo Lutheran Seminary, Reverend Dr. Richard Crossman, who couldn't be with us today, but who was a former chair of our Biotechnology Reference Group and Faith and Life Sciences Reference Group, and who taught me about genetically modified organisms in seminary, inspired that idea, awoke that idea within me, and then at one point thought that I might be a reasonable representative for the Lutheran Church on this committee, and that has been inspirational for me for the last 7 years. So we are all raised within our tradition. We are grown and mentored by those around us. As you heard from my colleagues, the work is bigger than any one denomination or more than any one or two individuals can hold, because it requires theological knowledge, ethical knowledge, science knowledge, the ability to communicate. And I think one of the biggest blessings of the work is how we communicate together. And some of our best conversations is when we have the wisdom of the whole group to think about specific technological challenges facing our society, Canadian society, or the world. And I think that many of the challenges that we're talking about are bigger than any one country or any one part of the world. They are global problems. And so they need to be addressed not just by a national ecumenical body, but by a global body. And perhaps we also need to think about how to include interfaith partners in that. Borrowing a word from Dr. Frimmer, the idea that ecumenical groups need to also be more involved in interfaith conversations or multi-faithism conversations is something that is, I'm thinking about these days, how we involve other faith denominations, faith traditions in this global work. Leah inspired us to think ecologically about life together, but science, when it has a new invention that may make money or may offer a certain new possibility, is quite reductionistic in some ways about how it is going to monopolize or progress that discovery, right? Whether we're talking about gene drives in mosquitoes, right? How do we solve the problem of malaria? Well, we'll genetically modify the mosquitoes that carry malaria, we'll wipe them out, then there won't be malaria. But we don't think about how mosquitoes are part of an ecosystem and what happens when you take a vital part of an ecosystem and you destroy it. What happens to that ecosystem? Or what will happen in this age where we can not just edit or augment creation, but also humanity, whether that is through gene editing or through brain-computer interfaces. Rosemary used the word cyborg, right? But the idea of a brain-computer interface is no longer science fiction. It is reality. The Australian company Synchron has developed these interfaces so that an individual can move their computer screen, the cursor on their computer screen, just with their thoughts, based on this stentrode technology that goes into the veins around the brain and allows their thoughts to move the computer. Now, you can say that for someone with ALS, that is a fantastic invention for rehab purposes, or if you have a transected spinal cord and you can't move your arms or your legs, to be able to bridge that gap, to give movement from a rehab perspective, that is a fantastic technology, absolutely. But then what happens when we talk about enhancement? Right? What happens when somebody says, well, it's not just enough to bring someone who has an illness or a disability back to a more normal level of function? What if we want to create the superhuman? The new eugenics is not just about gene editing, but also about artificial enhancement with computers. And so we are in a challenging time of human development, right? Theologically, we think, what does it mean to be created in the image of God? That's a question that we have wrestled with for the last 7 years that I've been involved with the Faith and Life Science Reference Group. What does it mean to be created in God's image, particularly at this time when we are able to modify humanity, to create something wholly different than has ever existed before? And how do we as humanity regulate some of these technologies when we have large countries and large biotechnology companies within those countries who don't wish to be regulated, right? Who don't wish to have any rules, regulations, policies, procedures, monitoring protocols created because they wish their technology to grow however it best suits them. So I have been inspired by the work that we have done in common. I've been inspired by the collegiality of the group and the conversations that we have together. I see no end to these conversations. I think they are becoming more urgent, and I'm delighted that we are again in partnership with the World Council of Churches through their Faith and Science Working Group, because I think this work that we have done for 25 years in Canada is enlightening to the World Council of Churches, but we need to do that work at that international level and then hopefully involve our multi-faith partners as well. An opportunity for questions. If you have any, perhaps you would come up to the microphone to ask the question, and then we could answer from the panel.
Thank you all very much for your talk. I found it incredibly intriguing. You talked about the lines between enhancing humans with technology and with the genetic editing. And I'm curious, what sorts of conclusions and or directions have we pursued so far, and what sort of progress has been made on those discussions within your group?
So I think we have engaged in conversation to educate ourselves, to educate our denominations. We've engaged in 3 webinars to help engage Canadian Christians and those who are interested in the reality of CRISPR gene editing techniques, how CRISPR has been attempts to regulate it in the past. And then we had our 3rd webinar was with the Canadian bioethicist Françoise Baylis from Dalhousie, who has been intimately working with the World Health Organization to help create an international framework, a regulatory system whereby that is both national and international, so that as these technologies become more available, they can have some kind of a regulatory framework. Now, that is a very early framework, and it is not comprehensive across the world, and there's very little compliance monitoring anywhere in the world, so it's an incomplete system. But I think what we have. So what have we done? How have we changed the world? I don't know that we have, as the 11 members of the Faith and Life Science Reference Group, changed the world, but we have come to understand that the world, some people in the world are making decisions that will lead to a more hopeful future, at least we think a more hopeful future for humanity. You're welcome. I have one comment, Stephen. You talked about the Oncomouse case, which was a landmark decision of the Supreme Court of Canada in 2002, and how CELA, the Canadian Environmental Law Association, was an active intervener at that time. We recently talked with the CELA and their executive director and asked what was the impact of that case 20 years later, and they came back with a legal memo written by one of their students. That is actually a case that comes up again and again in Canadian law. It is cited. It continues to live on, and one of the impacts of that piece of legislation is that there has been no further attempt to try and patent a higher life form in Canada. So since 2002, that has created a line that has not yet been crossed in Canada.
In the late 90s, early 2000s, biotechnology was seen by the Government of Canada as a key platform in the future economy. And at the time, there was a body called the Canadian Biotechnology Advisory Committee. And that was one way that the Biotechnology Reference Group would engage with people who had some influence in the policy sphere. CBAC no longer exists. So what body does the Faith and Life Sciences Reference Group engage with, or know that's there, that you can engage with in the absence of a department in the federal government?
I think a general response to that is that you have to deal with each department that may be related to the issue, so that it is very, there isn't a sort of government will to look at this, because I think they realize that these issues now are pervasive. Artificial intelligence, for example, came, it seemed relatively suddenly, and it's moved at tremendous speed. It's moved at tremendous speed in collecting the data for the AI, to the extent that it sounds almost like a harvest, that they've been harvesting these texts, this material, and they've almost come to an end, and they find that they're reusing or refinding some of the material that they used before. And of course, they've had a lot added to it, you know, all the, not just these student essays, but so much has been taken over by the artificial intelligence that you really are not certain of the origins, and you are not certain of the outcome. In fact, one of the issues, and we haven't really as a group been thinking about this, but one of the pervasive underlying issues is, where does all this drive come from? We know that there are a few billionaires who are funding artificial intelligence, but where does the drive come from? And where is the benefit of this enterprise? So that it really does go deeper and deeper into not just Ursula Franklin's social context, but also the political issues. So going back to that question, we really have to deal with things case by case.
Well, first of all, let me say thank you for your presentations. I found them very interesting, both historically and from the current work that you're looking at. I also want to commend the Faith and Sciences reference group for their webinars. I found them excellent. I did sit down. They're very, very helpful. My question is this. The traffic seems to be going from the church, the dialogue is with the scientists, with the areas that we're talking about, AI or genetic. What has come back to how have the churches changed their theological language or their theology itself from these encounters? I mean, so often we get caught in 16th century language for 21st century problems, and it seems to me that we have to figure out a way how our dialogue with these groups changes the churches themselves and their theological thinking, but also their the way of articulating their theology. So if you could offer some comments on that. I'm not sure who the best person is, but what have the scientists taught us about theology, maybe, as a short form?
That's a great question. Thank you for asking it. I'm not sure that that we have a good sense of how these conversations have changed theological thinking in individual denominations, and it may be something that we have to reflect on more. These conversations change us as individuals. They change us and how we interact with our denominations, how we interact with our world. We try and share that with our denominations through the writings that we share, through the webinars that we produce. I'm not sure that we could point to specific changes in denominational theological thinking.
Speaking of my experience with the Presbyterian Church in Canada, as far as I know, there was no one teaching this aspect of ethics in any of the divinity colleges, either at St. Andrews in Vancouver, Knox in Toronto, the University of Toronto, or Presbyterian College in Montreal. And so if it's not happening in the theological colleges, it means that those scholars who are responsible for training future ministers aren't dealing with the issues. but it also means that divinity students aren't learning why these issues are important. So I think, and I think there's a limit to what the Faith and Life Sciences Reference Group can do in terms of reaching out to all the divinity colleges. I think that needs to happen within that world, that these issues are taken seriously and grappled with ethically and morally. In the case of the Presbyterian Church, whenever I had statements to present to General Assembly, there would always be representatives from the colleges there, but that doesn't mean they would take up those issues in the teaching to students. So I think there's a link there that needs to be probed and learned. I think I never found in any reaction to anything I wrote where I was advising caution, that people would generally agree with, just because we can do it doesn't mean we should do it. But in terms of actually more actively engaging those teaching in the divinity schools, I think that's an issue for each of the denominations to maybe together figure out how can that happen. And that might be an agenda item at a future Faith and Life Sciences Reference Group. How can we do this? And where should it happen, and how might it happen?
Well, thank you for the question and for some of the answers. I feel I have to say something from a medical point of view, because certainly during the training of not only medical students, but also I think most healthcare students, and certainly within the health professions, there is an increasing, if we're talking 25 years, increasing expectation of ethical, sometimes it's called medical decision-making and critical thinking. It may not be called ethics, but their ethics and medical ethics is a profession on its own. It's gone beyond the ethics committees for research, that every research proposal has to have been seen by an ethics committee. And this seems to be really worldwide. One of the examples of the possibility of human enhancement, as it were, was the Chinese researcher who created twins who would be, he hoped, he expected from the genetic review, to be impervious to HIV infection. And he was actually imprisoned because of the worldwide revulsion and rejection of this, because it had not been reviewed ethically. Decision-making had not been reviewed ethically. And there were many issues which we did discuss actually in the group, but these decisions were made without the customary, and this is not related to any religious denomination or theological background, but the expectation that the human factor, as it were, would be taken into account. But I think certainly in the North, most of the health professions do include decision-making and ethics in their training and expectation of education.
Yeah, David always asks good questions. The thing I was just thinking about is that what's been interesting for me about the Faith and Life Sciences and Biotech Reference Group is that it's always kind of skirted the beginning of life questions and the end of life questions, whether it's abortion and reproductive rights or medical assistance in dying and euthanasia and the end of life questions. Because, how sacred is life, or what does it mean that life is sacred, is kind of right at the center of both of those questions. But what I think maybe has been helpful about the work of Faith and Life Sciences is that it's never come down to say it's a black and white kind of situation. It's given a set of tools to examine what are the promises, what are the perils, what are some of the criteria we use to evaluate this way or the other way in terms of ethical and moral decision making. And that hesitancy to go down black and white, non-nuanced conversations may be a contribution to those other issues about life at the beginning and at the end. Yeah.
Well, my great thanks to each of you for your contribution today and your contribution over these last 25 years. I have had the good pleasure of participating in, I think, most of the webinars in this last 2 years, and I believe we started with maybe 50, was it? In the first webinar, around 50 people, and I'm just letting folks know that there were over 350 signed up for the last webinar, and the videos are watched significantly online, and they move a long way across the globe. This is one good use of technological advancement, and it is, of course, what we're doing here online today. I would also point out that there's a connection between what we were just talking about in this evening, because Cesar Yaramillo from Project Plowshares will be talking about weaponization and the threat to security and peace in some of the same kind of ways. This is how we got the Climate, Peace and Security Conference here in Waterloo, because Cesar needed to pull together big stakeholder groups in Canada and say, who now is responsible for human well-being? And to figure out what layer of government was responsible so that you could have an ethical conversation and not be at the mercy of whoever was currently in charge. So I thank you, because what you had to speak of today can be so daunting, and yet you have made it so approachable, both in your writing, in your day-to-day work, on your webinars, and then here for us today. Thank you of the group for your great contribution. It does not go without saying. Thank you so kindly.